Bueno, buenos días a todos y todas. Estamos en un nuevo seminario de economía de SRA. La actividad la vamos a conducir en inglés, pero bueno, hoy está la presentación del expositor y del comentarista, la vamos a hacer en castellano. Estamos contentos de tener al profesor Sergio Levrero como presentador en el seminario de hoy. Sergio va a estar presentando un paper que se titula La regla de Taylor y sus consecuencias, una interpretación clásico keynesiana. Eh, Sergio es profesor asociado de Economía en la Universidad Roma III, donde enseña Economía Monetaria y coordina el máster de Economía. Estudió en la Universidad de Montfort de Leicester y en la Universidad de la Sapienza de Roma, donde hizo máster y doctorado, y sus principales intereses y actividades de investigación se centran en las teorías del valor y la distribución, los salarios y el mercado de trabajo, cuestiones de teoría monetaria y economía rafiana. Es presidente de Astril, miembro del Consejo de Administración de la Fundación Centro Srapa y editor en jefe del Bulletin of Political Economy. Y entre los diversos trabajos que ha publicado figuran Four Lectures on Wages and the Labor Market del 2012, los 3 volúmenes Srapa and the Reconstruction of Economic Theory del 2013, editado con Antonella Palumbo y Antonio Stirati, y numerosos artículos en revistas académicas y libros. Después de la presentación de Sergio, vamos a tener los comentarios de Louis-Philippe Rochon. Louis-Philippe es full professor de economía en la Laurentian University de Canadá, es editor fundador de la revista académica Review of Keynesian Economics y actualmente editor en jefe de Review of Political Economy. Es editor consultivo de la nueva revista Advances in Economics Education y editor asociado de Journal of Business and Economic Studies. Es miembro del comité editorial de 13 revistas académicas, editor en jefe de la colección sobre banca central y política monetaria, editada por Elgar. Ha sido profesor visitante en más de 20 países, coeditor del Monetary Policy Institute y editor del Monetary Blog. Y ha realizado numerosos trabajos en política monetaria, teoría monetaria, economía post-keynesiana, que han sido publicados en diversas revistas académicas internacionales. Bueno, después de esta breve introducción, cambiamos al inglés. I switch to English. Sergio, we thank again for participating in the seminar, and the floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you for the invitation to the seminar here at the Central Bank of Argentina, which will be based on 2 of my papers published in 2022 and 2023. So the aims of this work was to first to discuss to what extent the Taylor rule can be considered an appropriate representation of the behavior of central bank in order to stabilize the economy leaning against the wind, and second, to rationalize the tendency of central bank to react to price inflation by increasing the interest rates when following a classical Keynesian approach. Before analyzing these 2 points, it is important to specify that the analysis was carried out having in mind the experience of the United States and other major advanced countries. And this explains why I did not refer in my analysis to the exchange rate. On the other hand, on a theoretical ground, when discussing the traditional interpretation of the Taylor rule as advanced in the new consensus models, the criticism to the notion of a natural interest rate that will be advanced implies also a criticism to the notion of a natural or equilibrium exchange rate. Moreover, in these models, the deviation of the real exchange rate from this natural or equilibrium exchange rate are driven, as in Excel, precisely by the discrepancies between the market and natural interest rate according to the purchasing power parity condition and the interest parity condition. And when discussing the Taylor rule in an alternative interpretation, you have, of course, that as you have a conventional interest rate, you also have a conventional exchange rate. And for the major advanced countries, you have some space for an independent monetary policy, even in an open economy. However, some issues concerning an open economy will be considered at the end of this presentation, specifically in discussing conflict inflation due to the impact of the real exchange rate on income distribution. And I think that looking at this graph, you can have an idea of this impact, and it refers, of course, precisely to Argentina. But let us start with a brief description of the limits of the activist approach to the Taylor rule. Starting from Taylor himself, I have problem with switching the slides, so now if I want to come back, yes, no. Starting from Taylor himself, it is widely recognized that the Taylor rule does not fit the data well, except during the era of the Great Moderation, from the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s. And this failure of the Taylor rule have been explained first in terms of mistakes in the conduct of monetary policy as offered by Taylor himself for the years before and after the 2007 crisis, and second by emphasizing, for instance, that the output gap and the natural interest rate are unknown and must be estimated, that the natural or benchmark real rate of interest may change over time, that central banks tend to smooth the changes in the rate of interest due to the uncertainty on the true values of those unobservable variables, the structure of the economy, and the lags in the effects of monetary policy. The first explanation of this inability of the Taylor rule to fit well the data has, of course, the limit that if systematic errors occur, they reveal that other factors influenced the monetary policy, namely that central banks followed a different rule, the optimality of which should be discussed in comparison with the Taylor rule, possibly also in terms of their effects on the average amount of labor unemployment and underemployment, besides output volatility. But if we consider the other explanation, the second one, it has led to a variety of specification of the rule according to the hypothesis made on the parameters and the unobservable variable that appear in the rule. So, for instance, we have the smoothing of interest rate as in the rule advanced by Rodebush and Svensson in 1999, or we have a variable natural rate of interest that shifts the constant term of the rule over time, as in the rule advanced by Laubach and Williams in 2003. So we have several specifications of the Taylor rule. And keeping this in mind, we can start to advance a list of criticism, let's say, to what we can call the activist view about the Taylor rule. First, the variety of the Taylor rule question its prescriptive role and implies several difficulties for monetary policy implementation. Now I refer mainly to what was pointed out by Yellen in 2012. I'm quoting her, a wide variety of simple rules creates difficulties for the monetary policy because, I'm always quoting Yellen, their policy implications can differ significantly depending depending on the particular specification. And her suggestion to take into consideration various rules when setting the policy interest rate indeed acknowledges in a sense, the discretionary nature of the monetary policy. However, the most serious drawback in the Taylor rule is its reference to an unobservable natural interest rate that must be estimated and is affected solely by real factors such as productivity growth, the growth of the workforce, the time preference of households, and movements in government expenditure. The first problem that immediately arises in this respect for the monetary authorities is that you have a variety of estimates methods. And these different estimate methods provide central banks with different benchmark interest rates. Second, these different methods are associated with different theoretical notions of the natural rate of interest based on the hypothesis made according to the degree of market imperfections and the time span that is considered. So, for instance, the natural rates may range from Wicksel's long-run efficient natural rate, that is the equilibrium rate that would occur on average in conditions of perfect competition, to the short-run rate which would prevail when the effects of temporary shocks are not averaged out and the output is at a level at which inflation does not accelerate when market imperfections are taken into consideration. So you have a range, in a sense, of theoretical natural rates. And in this latter case, central banks have the additional problem of defining and measuring the imperfections in the labor, credit, and good market. It is for these difficulties that Blinder in 1998 stated that the natural rate of interest would be more a concept than a number, a way to think about monetary policy rather than a rule. And in order to have an idea of the problems that these different notion of the natural rate of interest can determine for the implementation of the monetary policy, we can refer to what Robertson several decades ago distinguished, that is between a quasi-natural rate of interest and a natural rate of interest. So, for instance, consider a permanent shift of the IS curve from IS1 to IS2. If the monetary authorities don't change the interest rate, output will fall to Y1, look at the figure that I'm showing you, below its potential level, YP. But if at this point, a temporary shift of the IS curve on the left occurs due to an increase, for instance, as written by Robertson, in the propensity to save and a decrease of firm willingness to invest during the crisis, the settlement of the rate of interest to what would have been the new normal rate IN2 will not assure output that comes back to its potential level. The benchmark of the monetary authorities should indeed be the quasi-natural rate of interest IQN1 or IQN2, according to the kind of shift of the temporary shift of the IS curve as shown by the red lines in the graph, taking this temporary shift. And on the other hand, the work of the monetary authorities may be complicated further by the fact that also the potential output might change during the crisis, a possibility usually neglected, or at least until some years ago, in the new Keynesian model. And an example of these different benchmark rates is the one that we have during the 2007 financial crisis. In actual fact, those who referred to a long-run notion of the natural rate of interest that would be in the US around 2.53% tended to criticize the Federal Reserve monetary policy after 2010 for being too expansionary. And on the contrary, those who refer to a quasi-natural rate of interest and deemed that it fell sharply during the crisis, achieving also negative value, evaluated the stance of monetary policy as still not expansionary, even when bringing the policy rate toward zero. And they also usually call nowadays for a rapid rise in these rates, forecasting an increasingly positive natural rate of interest over the next few years. But if this variety of estimates of the natural rate of interest complicates the specification of the Taylor rule, its traditional interpretation and its implementation according to the modern theory of central banking is further questioned, in my opinion, by the fact that the curves of the output gap and prices can differ from the one expected with the new Keynesian model. In this theory, an increase in the rate of interest should lead to a fall in aggregate demand, especially consumption and investment, thus allowing monetary policy to lean against the wind. Moreover, through this demand channel, the increase in the rate of interest would be accompanied by a lower rate of inflation. If this does not occur, it would be due to a contemporaneous increase in the natural rate of interest that would determine a scant elasticity of output to the interest rate. Well, this view on monetary policy can be questioned on both empirical and theoretical grounds. A fundamental criticism concerns the existence itself of a natural rate of interest, which is determined by productivity and thrift and is independent of monetary factors. In his general theory, as well known, Keynes argued that savings equalize investment by changes in income and deemed the notion of the natural rate of interest to be not useful, stressing that the rate of interest is a monetary phenomenon to which capital profitability will adjust. This criticism to the traditional theory of the interest rate has been reinforced by the capital debate of the 1960s, because the dependence of the value of the capital endowment on relative prices and thus on the rate of interest make it impossible to take the supply of capital as a single magnitude that is given when determining the relative prices, which entails, and this is something that sometimes is not really understood, which entails that potential output and therefore the amount of full employment saving cannot be precisely defined like the full employment marginal product of labor, which requires a given amount of capital to be calculated. Moreover, as the capital controversy has shown, a decreasing supply curve of first bond with regard to the interest rate cannot be obtained due to the phenomena of reswitching and reverse capital deepening. And indeed, in the full employment saving investment market, there may be multiple equilibria, a capital labor ratio that in equilibrium is not necessarily higher for a lower interest rate, and changes in the rate of interest out of the equilibrium that are so strong that they question the validity of the theory. And this undermines the foundation of the idea of a natural rate of interest determined by productivity and thrift found by the monetary policy. And it also questions the neoclassical mechanism granting the tendency of actual to potential output, which is based on the inverse relation between the rate of interest and the amount of investment. And of course, the problem that can be raised is, but is this criticism valid with respect to the last macroeconomics model? Also, for instance, to the last macroeconomics new Keynesian model, as the ones advanced, for instance, by Woodford. Yes, I mean, I believe, it's my opinion, and I worked on this, that this criticism is still valid also for this model, because in this model, you have in some part the reference to the idea of capital as a single money. So this idea is still present in those models. But moving to more empirical grounds, the view of the Taylor rule to lean against the wind by changing the policy interest rate in order to stabilize price inflation is challenged by several factors. First, and this is relevant because this rule is a rule that you should use precisely to lean against the wind. So also during the cycle, in order to stabilize the economy. First, although central bank can shape on average market expectation, in the short run, changes in the short-term interest rate may not be followed by changes in the same direction in the long-term interest rate. Second, a low and asymmetric elasticity of aggregate demand to the long-term interest rate has been pointed out several times with respect to consumption, investment, and you can think also to the debate on the so-called IS puzzle, that is the lack of sensitivity of output to changes in the interest rate. Of course, this does not mean that monetary policy does not have an effect now, but it suggests that this effect varies according to circumstances and passes through channels which are less mechanical than those based on substitution mechanisms shaping the neoclassical demand for and supply of savings. And in this respect, you can think to the effects that a change in the monetary policy can have on income distribution, on the exchange rate, and therefore on net export, on the cost of the service of public debt, and credit conditions for durable consumption, and the effect of a change in the interest rate on residential investment. Another point that can be stressed refers to the relationship between the interest rate and the price level. The idea to lean against the wind by changing the interest rate is questioned also by the existence of a cost channel of monetary policy, namely the direct relation on impact between the interest rate and the level of prices. And this cost channel of the monetary policy can overwhelm the demand channel, so that if the monetary authorities face an increase in price inflation by increasing the interest rate as prescribed by the Taylor rule, they can determine on impact a higher and not a lower inflation rate. Of course, I stress here the term on impact, which implies also that if after a fall in the interest rate, we observe a fall in price or on impact, a lower inflation rate, this does not afford any indication that the natural rate of interest should be lower, as stated by the new consensus model. But looking at the new Keynesian model, the idea that the positive output gap can have persistent and accelerating effects on inflation may also be questioned. In this model, demand pull inflation will accelerate in the absence of a reaction by central bank, because it is assumed that expected inflation is fully passed on actual price change. But if this hypothesis is removed, a long-run or permanent trade-off between inflation and the unemployment rate occurs, as in the old version of the Philip curve. That is to say, before Friedman's introduction of the notion of an unemployment rate with which inflation doesn't accelerate. This means that we will have different neutral interest rate with which inflation does not accelerate, and policymakers have the possibility of choosing the desired pair of inflation and output gap. So, with a backward-looking Phillips curve, assuming that cost shocks epsilon t average out, and that the parameter ht, that is the sensibility of to the expected inflation rate, is lower than 1, we will have that when the expected and actual inflation rate are equal, that is when P Greek T in the expression shown in the slide, the P Greek T is equal to P Greek T minus 1, you will have the expression P Greek equal to Qt minus QL divided lambda times 1 minus H. And so a stable, in a sense, long-run Phillips curve. But we can also say something more, because in the absence of cost-push inflation, this trade-off between output and inflation would also tend to disappear, since potential output tends to adjust to the cost of actual output. The usual explanation of this possibility of an adjustment of potential output to the course, the trend of actual output, is usually advanced in terms of supply effect rather than demand factors. But this adjustment indeed can stem from productive capacity adjusting to changes in the aggregate demand, as implied by the tendency of firms to achieve a normal degree of capacity utilization through changes in business investment. And this suggests that there is no exogenously given unique stable equilibrium, as advanced in, at least in some version of the new consensus model. And moreover, this implies that any monetary that persists may become a natural rate of interest in a Wicksellian sense, that is, a rate that guarantees stable prices. So there are three elements stemming from the analysis carried out so far that must be stressed before advancing an alternative interpretation. First, if on average an inflation rate persists and in some circumstances even accelerate, this must stem from cost inflation as fueled by conflicted claims on income distribution. As we will see, it is in this framework that an alternative but not mechanical interpretation of the Taylor rule can be advanced. Second, the uncertainty about the effects of monetary policy on prices and the level of output explain why central banks usually tend to react slowly to price inflation, what has been called the speed limit rule. And finally, it is admitted that simple rules neglect other factors that influence monetary policy, explaining the variability over time and among countries of the central bank's reaction to price inflation. And these factors refer to the condition of the financial market, the role of the central bank as a lender of last resort, the limits imposed by the zero lower bound on monetary policy, the adoption in some circumstances of an activist policy to ensure full employment, and finally, the minimization of the cost of the service of public debt. However, as shown also nowadays, we cannot overlook the fact that one concern of central bank is price stability, and that we find in several references of the Taylor rule to achieve this goal in their official documents. And the goal of price stability can be explained by different factors. One is the fact that, of course, inflation can affect rents and fixed income. More importantly, that central banks act, and now we can quote in this respect Godard, that central banks act as manager of the bank club, defending lenders against inflations and strengthening the international position of the domestic financial sector. And in this respect, they may try to defend a target real rate of interest by reacting to money, wages, and prices increases with an increase in the policy rate. And as we'll see, this can fuel a wage price spiral and be in conflict with the goal itself of price stability, at least in the short run. Well, an alternative interpretation combining can be advance of the Taylor rule, combining the idea of the monetary nature of the rate of interest as suggested by Garignani, Piretti, Panico, Smithin, and others, with the idea of a rate of unemployment that is able to reconcile the conflicting claims of workers and capitalists on income distribution. And we can say that there are some key elements behind this alternative interpretation that must be stressed. The first one is that the benchmark or targeted real rate of interest of the central bank has to be recognized as a policy determined variable, which is only masqueraded by the central bankers as an objective feature of the economy. In other words, as in Keynes, we refer to the benchmark rate of the central bank and the interest rate as a conventional phenomenon to which capital profitability eventually will adjust. The second element is that the wage rate must be above the subsistence level, because if not, an inflation barrier will be set up for a given technique adjusting the real interest rate to the value that is socially viable with the maximum rate of profit. Third, at least on average, central bank must be able to affect both the short-term and long-term interest rates by means of the bank system refinancing and open market operation. And finally, of course, as I have already said, as in several work on conflict distribution, the rate of employment is one of the elements influencing workers' claims in wage bargaining. So, in this respect, let us assume that the targeted wage rate by the workers is influenced negatively by the rate of unemployment and positively by the trade union membership as a proxy of the workers' degree of organization, by labor productivity, and by other social and political factors. Moreover, for the sake of simplicity, let us indicate the nominal markup with me equal to I plus NP, where NP are the normal profits of enterprise that, according to Smith and Ricardo, remunerate the risk and trouble to make a productive investment, and I is the nominal rate of interest on long-term risked bonds as influenced by the central bank. And always for the sake of simplicity, but in the paper, and I have analyzed these points by means of a price system, but for the sake of simplicity, consider the markup pricing P equal to 1 plus me times W divided Y, where me is the nominal markup that can be influenced by the nominal interest rate set by the central bank, W is the nominal wage rate, and Y is the labor productivity. So Y over W over Y is the unit labor cost. The first step to move towards an alternative explanation of the Taylor rule is to clarify the effects of wage bargaining on the real rate of interest. And one-off increase in money wages could bring about an increase in real wages, since prices initially adjust to historical cost of capital, and the real interest rate, that is the opportunity cost of any capital invested in production, will happen to be lower than the initial given nominal interest rate. However, if the increase in money wages is only una tantum, this increase in real wages will be temporary in nature, because input prices will eventually adjust to the reproduction value. And so you can have a permanent change in the real wage only if workers obtain continuous increase in their money wages, provided that the monetary authorities leave the nominal interest rate on long-term risk bonds unchanged. And this increase in real wages, namely the fall in the prices to money wage ratio, will not occur only if monetary authorities increase the nominal rate of interest in order to maintain a targeted real rate of interest. Namely, if they set the policy rate I star according to the relation 1 plus I star equal to 1 plus IRT times 1 plus gamma, where gamma is the rate of change of money wages and IRT is the targeted real rate of interest. Having clarified this first step, we can pass to the second step, and it is the one according to which we must introduce an aspiration gap that can arise between the central bank's goal and workers' claim, thus determining a wage price spiral. So let us suppose that workers and their organization react to the rise in the nominal rate of interest, which has kept the real interest rate at the value IRT by asking for an increase in money wages greater than gamma in order to achieve a targeted real wage rate, which is greater than the rate that corresponds to the real interest rate aimed at by the central bank. And so let us assume that the new rate of change of money wages will be phi equal to gamma plus something that take into account the discrepancy between the targeted real wage by the workers and the actual real wage. But let us suppose again that after this stronger increase in money wages, the central bank reacts in turn again by setting the nominal rate of interest, the policy rate of interest, equal to phi plus 1 plus phi times IRT, which means that the real rate of interest remains again unchanged. Well, under this condition, there will be increasing inflation. We can trace the line of the real wage rates claimed by workers for different unemployment rate according to the expression that we have seen before, and the line CBW of the real wage corresponding to the real interest rate targeted by the central bank, which is equal to the labor productivity divided by 1 plus mi star, where mi star is the markup that guarantee that the real interest rate is equal to the one targeted by the central bank. Of course, taking in this case, for the sake of simplicity, as given the normal profits of enterprise. Well, the intersection between these two curves provide us with the value of an unemployment rate that may be labeled as a non-accelerated inflation unemployment rate. And this rate is higher the real interest rate targeted by the central bank, or the higher the real wage claim by workers in wage bargaining for a given unemployment rate. And on the contrary, this non-accelerating inflation unemployment rate will be lower if an increase in labor productivity or an improvement in the terms of trade occur. If now we consider that taking Y as given, absolute prices may change for a change in the nominal wage rate and the nominal markup me, and that the rate of changes of money wages is determined by the expected inflation rate, in this case equal to to some adaptive scheme of expectation, plus the discrepancy between the non-accelerated inflation, the non-accelerated unemployment rate and the actual unemployment rate, because the lower the unemployment rate is, the greater is the worker expiration gap, we can get the Phillips curve, according to which the rate of inflation at time t is equal to h plus the rate of inflation at time t minus 1, plus again the discrepancy between the non-accelerated inflation rate of unemployment and the actual unemployment rate. And when UT, you can look to the graph that I am showing you, when UT is lower than UNA, an accelerating inflation will occur because the real wage claimed by the workers is higher than the real wage that is consistent with the real interest rate targeted by the central bank. And this accelerated inflation will be driven by continuous increase in the nominal interest rate and the consequent growing nominal wage demands by workers. And it will only stop if the rate of unemployment rise or the central bank lowers its target real interest rate, or if workers accept lowering their claims on income distribution. And in this respect, the monetary authorities can be pushed to change their targeted real interest rate due, for instance, to a given inflation target and the effect of increasing inflation on real savings, fixed incomes, and the external constraint. And for their part, the workers and their organization may reduce the targeted real wage rate for each unemployment rate due to the negative effects of price inflation on the real earnings of the less organized workers and other sectors of society, as well as the fear that restrictive fiscal and monetary policies will be implemented. And in turn, the actual implementation of these policies will lower workers' claim due to the consequent increase in the rate of unemployment, a movement along the WWC curve, as well as because this increase will affect the workers' degree of organization and the social political context. And so you can have a shift in the WWC curve. It is also worth noting that the average, not the target, but the average real wage that you can have over a certain period of time will be influenced in actual fact by the reaction wages, sorry, the reaction functions of workers and central banks, namely by the speed with which wage bargaining adjusts the nominal wages and central banks change the nominal rate of interest. It will also be influenced by the speed with which firms pass the increase in the nominal markup due to the increase in the interest rate onto price. And these last remarks are important because they suggest that this notion of the non-accelerating inflation and employment rate that we have introduced must not be interpreted as an equilibrium unemployment rate as in the new Keynesian model. Indeed, since central banks do not usually speedily adjust the nominal interest rate, and their targeted real interest rate is influenced by several factors, different average unemployment rates may be able to avoid accelerated inflation, determining a long-run trade-off between unemployment and wage inflation, which is similar to the one originally advanced by Phillips. The non-accelerated inflation of unemployment, rate of unemployment, only shows the unemployment rate that is structurally, in a sense, needed to ensure for a given degree of workers' organization a stable inflation rate and a certain real interest rate when this real interest rate is aimed at by the central bank. And with these caveats in mind, the rationalization of wage bargaining in terms of the aspiration gap combined with an inflation targeting by the central bank may lead to a reaction function which is formally similar to the one advanced by Taylor, but different in its economic meaning. In fact, assume that for a certain degree of workers' organization, the unemployment rate is too low to ensure a targeted real rate of interest, together with a stable targeted inflation rate. The central bank may try to fulfill these goals by raising the nominal interest rate. Specifically, its increase must not only be able to defend the targeted real interest rate, but also ensure an increase in the unemployment rate that puts workers' wage claims under control. In fact, only when the actual unemployment rate is equal to the unemployment rate according to which the inflation does not accelerate, you will have a stable inflation rate. That is, you do not have a change over time in the inflation rate. However, only an appropriate level of unemployment can guarantee an inflation rate which is equal to the one desired by the central bank. Therefore, the difference between the actual real interest rate pursued by the central bank and its initial targeted real value, and consequently the required change in the nominal interest rate, can be viewed as a function of the discrepancy between this structurally unemployment rate according to which the inflation does not accelerate and the actual unemployment rate, plus the difference between the actual inflation rate and the targeted inflation rate by the central bank, which is, in a sense, a kind of Taylor rule. And it also implies that if a targeted inflation rate is to be achieved, the reactivity of aggregate demand to a rise in the interest rate must be, on average, sufficiently high. And there are four essential differences between these relations and the new Keynesian Taylor rule. Here, the main concern is cost-push inflation. Indeed, changes in the degree of utilization of productive capacity do not usually imply per se a change in the inflation rate. Second, the targeted real rate of interest is not determined by real factors as in the new consensus models, but is seen as a monetary phenomenon. Of course, the monetary authorities don't decide their policy rates in a vacuum. They will take the course of money wages and the conditions of the labor and commodity markets into account. The rate targeted by the central bank, however, does not ensure any optimal configuration of the economy as in the new consensus model, and its changes affect income distribution and the level of output or the trend of growth of the economy. Third, the sensitivity of aggregate demand to the rate of interest can be low, and varies according to the circumstances. And so, in order to achieve the target, you need that a change in a sign of monetary policy be accompanied also by fiscal policies moving in the same direction. And among the circumstances that can made an effectiveness of the or an effect in the opposite direction with respect to the one side by the central bank, we can consider open economies. You must, for instance, also analyze whether an appreciation of the exchange rate has an expansionary or contractionary effect on the level of output. Finally, in my interpretation, the emphasis is on cost push inflation, and for this reason, a relevance can be ascribed to the distributive effects of changes in the real exchange rate. And I think that this can be easily shown by introducing in the price system a matrix of imported inputs and the nominal exchange rate and the vector price of the imported goods. By looking this, you can see that if you have, for instance, an increase in the exchange rate E, which corresponds to a depreciation of the currency, this will lead, given the technique and given the money wages and the nominal markup, this will lead to a rise in the level of prices and so a fall in the real wage rate. And of course, this effect must be taken into account when you discuss the appropriate monetary policy. But what I would like to stress, and this is something that is not in the paper that I have written, is that the effect of this change in the exchange rate can be different according to the circumstances. So, for instance, if the appreciation in the exchange rate or the depreciation in the exchange rate, but now let us consider an appreciation of the exchange rate, and so in a sense an improvement in the terms of trade, is the appreciation in the exchange rate is achieved without changing the interest rate, for instance, lowering the country risk, changing the expected exchange rate by using international reserves or currency swaps. In this case, with an improvement in the terms of trade and appreciation of the exchange rate, you will have a higher real wage. But if the appreciation is achieved by raising the interest rate, the final effect on the real wage will depend from the effect on prices of the changes of both these elements of cost. And therefore, it will depend from the weight of imported goods in the production process, the weight of imported goods in the bundle of consumption of workers, the strength of international competition for tradable goods, and so on, so forth. So you cannot, in a sense, think of a precise and definite effect of a change in the exchange rate stemming from a change in the interest rate. You must analyze these according to circumstances and of course according to the specific economic characteristic of the countries that you are considering. So, for instance, this effect will be different in Italy than in Argentina. And the same thing stems from the effect of a depreciation of the exchange rate. If we look to the experience of Italy, we see that the effect of the depreciation of the exchange rate was very different in different historical times. So in the 1970s, the strong depreciation of our currency was not accompanied by a fall in the real wages. Indeed, in the 70s of the last centuries, you had the higher increase in the real wages than in ever other period of the history of our country, but due to the strength, the strong bargaining position of workers. And on the other hand, you have had a completely different effect of the depreciation after the depreciation of the 1992. In that case, you have had a fall in the real wage. And I stop here because, I mean, I have been already too long. Thank you to everybody.
Thank you very much, Sergio, for your presentation. We'll move to Luis Philippe's comment, and then we open the floor for some questions or comments by the participants. Luis Philippe.
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting me to comment. Second of all, I do want to mention that this paper has been accepted in the Review of Political Economy. I'm not sure when it will be published, but it is published online for those interested in reading the paper more carefully. From reading the paper, I get that there's two sort of big parts, essentially. One is questioning or asking whether Taylor rules are really representative of central bank behavior. And I mean this, I understand this to mean, is IT, inflation targeting, and new consensus models, are they still relevant? If the answer is no, are they still relevant, therefore, for monetary policy? And the second part of the paper is a classical Keynesian or a Sraffian proposal as an alternative. So let me begin with what I liked about the paper. I think I very much agree with the criticism of new consensus models, of Taylor rules. And it's a criticism that very much overlaps with my own, although it maybe perhaps a little bit more technical. But it does show that there are different ways of criticizing this new consensus model. And, you know, brings me, and I'm very happy with this criticism, because I remember when post-Keynesians started writing about new consensus models, maybe some 12, 13 years ago, there was a lot of enthusiasm. I'm thinking of Fontana, I'm thinking of others who were very enthusiastic about new consensus models and arguing, there you go, the central banks have become post-Keynesians, they've recognized endogenous money, etc. But over time, this criticism, this enthusiasm has been pushed aside in favor more of a critical approach. Lavoie and Feiberger wrote a really good paper, I think in the Journal of Economic Issues a few years ago, essentially saying that new consensus models are nothing but monetarism Mark II. It's all Friedman all over again. And so now we're sort of seeing a lot more of the differences. And in that sense, I welcome this paper. Now, I do want to say just as a side story, Basil Moore once told me that John Taylor got the idea for the Taylor rule from one of Basil's classes. The story is that Taylor was a student of Basil, and that through Basil's class, got the idea of a Taylor rule. Now, I haven't been able to verify that story, but if it is true, I'm not that surprised, because I've become over the years very critical of Basil's views on endogenous money, and hence, you know, this whole activist sort of approach. Now, let me say something about the Taylor rule. Does it fit the data? Probably not. Does it matter that much? And I say that because while it is a theory in search of the data, I think sometimes in this paper, and I've made this comment to him last night, I think that sometimes the paper can't see the forest through the trees, that it gets too bogged down in the different sort of different types of, you know, varieties of Taylor rules, and asking the questions of whether they're appropriate amendments and etc. For me, I think that we need to, while I appreciate the exercise, I think we need to take a step back sometimes and remind ourselves what this new consensus model is. And in referencing Levrero at the beginning, when I mentioned that it was about monetarism, I think we have to keep that in mind. And the author does that sometimes through the paper. He mentions Excel and etc. But I think we have to remind ourselves that new consensus models, Taylor rules, inflation targeting is about inflation hysteria. It's the idea that low and stable inflation is a public good, that low and stable inflation is the best sort of macroeconomic output that will then generate stability and etc. So we need to keep that. We need to keep in mind that it is an inflation at all cost a model. We need especially to keep in mind that it embeds this idea of monetary policy dominance or monetary TINA, the idea that only monetary policy is capable of achieving a target. We have to question the idea of an inflation target. We have to question the idea of fine-tuning, and we have to question the idea of inflation being demand determined. And at times the author sort of touches on this. I would have liked to maybe see maybe a small section sort of saying, this is what the model is. And, you know, we need to reject step by step every aspect or every element of this model from a heterodox or critical perspective. Now, in addition to that, if we break down the model, it really comes down to a monetary policy transmission mechanism that's based on an IS curve and a Phillips curve. And here the author mentions this in the sense he mentions the inelasticity of investment or even consumption goods to changes in the rate of interest. And this, I think, is a very important thing to remember. And he also mentions this flat Phillips curve. And that is imperative that we remind ourselves of that, because what a flat Phillips curve means is, even given this inelasticity of the IS curve, you require many increases in interest rates to exploit that flat portion of your Phillips curve to finally lead to a decrease in output and perhaps a decrease in inflation, although the two may not be related, especially if inflation is cost push. So, so we need to remind ourselves of that, and the author does that in some ways. And so it leads to the question of, is monetary policy the wrong policy to deal with economic activity and inflation? I've written a paper or a few where I mention the general ineffectiveness of monetary policy to achieve an inflation target for the reasons I mentioned above. I think that the primary transmission mechanism of monetary policy is through income distribution, which was part of my presentation with Mario Secareccia at the central bank. And I realize this is an empirical question, but I do think that it is the primary channel. And the author also kind of mentions this a little bit as well. And in terms of hysteria, you know, we know that the central banks really are grounded in this inflation hysteria. We saw that with the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, where the Fed had to choose between financial stability and inflation, and it chose inflation by raising interest rates days, weeks after the collapse of certain banks. We still see them very much involved and grounded in monetary policy dominance. There has been no discussion of fiscal policy except for some heterodox people. Steve Pressman wrote a wonderful blog on this. Isabella Weber did some work on that. And so we have to keep that in mind, especially now when interest rates are at 5% in some countries or near 5% in others. So to go back to the main question of the paper, is this new consensus model still relevant, despite perhaps the lack of fit with the data? I think it is. There's a great quote by some Fed researchers that, and I use it. He says, although the Fed may respond modestly or not at all to its policy objectives for extended periods of time, this pattern of behavior may be interrupted by periods where the Fed responds more aggressively to a single objective. And this is exactly what's happening today. I think there were questions about, I gave a paper last year, I think maybe, in Spain, where someone was saying, oh, you know, new consensus models, no one's talking about that anymore. But sure enough, with inflation, you see the resurgence of this, you know, this monetarist thinking, which is really what the model is. Levrero, in his recent book, has said it's still the bread and butter of central bank researchers. De Pola has said the core of the new consensus model research program is unchanged and remains a dominant scientific research program. So I think that I'm not prepared to dismiss the model as central bank policy. Regarding Sergio's proposals, I have a bit of questions because I'm a bit confused with that part for a few reasons. Is the author not really suggesting some sort of activist rule, maybe based not on a monetary target, but on some sort of real target like unemployment? Jerry Epstein has done work on that, but I'm wondering if that's part of his thinking. And I guess, I'm going to end with a few, just this comment. You know, in my view, I think we're asking central banks to do too much. Monetary policy is clumsy. Monetary policy is, you know, a difficult tool with a lot of improbabilities. That explains their step approach, you know, their wait and see approach in monetary policy. That explains why interest rates go up 10 times and more. I think in the end, we really have to abandon these activist rules because they're inefficient. And we really have to stick to some sort of long run rule, like the parking it rules, whether it's the Pazinetti rule or et cetera. And then sort of rely on fiscal policy. And here I think the paper, the biggest shortcoming of the paper is his omission of discussing fiscal policy. He mentions it briefly, but there's no real sort of statement on that. And that's sort of the dog that did not bark. So I would have liked to hear saying, you know, monetary policy. I guess this is what I'm asking, Sergio. Do you still believe in the effectiveness of monetary policy, or would you rather sort of, you know, let it set interest rates in the long run fashion and revert back to fiscal policy? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Philippe, for your comments. Maybe Sergio, you would like to react to the comments before we open the floor to further questions?
Yes. So there are several points, and yes, of course, I agree that the new consensus model, the inflation targeting, is a kind of new, is a version introducing, of course, something else as money endogeneity in the short run of the monetarist approach, and that you have there, in a sense, an inflation hysteria. And I have analyzed these in the other paper concerning the Taylor rule written in 2022, where I precisely reconstruct the history that led to the construction of this rule by Taylor, starting from the first rules advance in the United States by Friedman and Simon. Here the problem is I think that we can distinguish two elements. The first one is the mechanism which is considered in order to achieve a targeted inflation rate and the targeted inflation rate. So when you refer to inflation hysteria, yes, of course, but this stems from the fact that you assume a very low inflation target. So, for instance, yesterday here in Italy, Draghi said that the European Central Bank is right in maintaining and trying to achieve an inflation, a targeted inflation rate of 2%. But why 2%? Not why 5%, not why 4%. This is never explained very well, also by Friedman and others. So, and that is the target inflation rate. But in the Taylor rule, as in the new consensus model, you have something more. You have a mechanism. You have an idea of a precise mechanism that will be able to achieve this targeted inflation rate. And so all the first part of my article is to show that this is not the case, both in an empirical ground and also in a theoretical ground. And I think that I have criticized precisely the theoretical ground of these models, which is based on the notion of the natural interest rate. Because when you criticize that notion, you are criticizing the idea that you have fluctuation in prices or in the rate of inflation and in output because you have a discrepancy between the actual and the natural rate of interest, and that you will have a tendency to achieve the equilibrium if the central bank follow some kind of rule, as the Taylor rule, trying to fix the interest rate to the benchmark rate given by the natural rate of interest. So I think that I have tried to criticize the fundamental elements of the new consensus model, that of course is still the model which prevails at the level of central bank. But because this is the case, you must criticize it, looking at the model, entering into the model. So now I answer to something that you said me yesterday. The forest is made of trees, and according to a proverb, you must look to the leaves to discover their mystery. So you know, when you discuss the inflation targeting, the Taylor rule, I think that you must do also this. Yes, you must also try to enter into this detail, showing the problem that this model had. So, with respect to the in a sense reconstructive part of the model. No, I am not suggesting any real target for the central bank. I think that the monetary policy can have an effect both on distribution and on the level of activity. And that in setting the level of the interest rate, they take into account several elements, the price stability, but for the effect that this price stability has on the real value of savings, the external position of a country, also, but not in the last decades, but in, for instance, after the Second World War, also the effect of the monetary policy on the cost of the service of the public debt. So we must, I think that the monetary policy is really relevant for the determination of income distribution and for the determination of the level of activity. But I have no idea of, I am not suggesting any activist rule and any idea of some kind of real interest rate that you must achieve. This can be considered according to the circumstances. And also, you know, I have in a sense a very political economy approach on these matters. What is the monetary policy is also the result of, in a sense, the overall strength position of the different parties, of the workers, of the capitalists, and so on and so forth. It is not neutral. There is nothing neutral and nothing objective in the choices and in the decision of the central bank. And what I think that you must not do is to use something rule in order to lean against the wind. This is really, you must not do that. You can have a perverse effect. So you must not do that. And this is the point of the first part of my article. I have tried to say, if the central bank would like to achieve a certain real interest rate, it must take into account some elements. And so I have suggested that you can have a certain rate of unemployment that you need in order to ensure that real targeted interest rate. Okay, but I am not saying that you have a sort of equilibrium rate of unemployment that you can achieve by fixing that real interest rate. It is not so. Okay, I am not suggesting this. I am suggesting that if the central bank would like to achieve a certain goal, it must take into consideration some elements. And in fact, I have used the word structural relation. So I have not an activist approach. Why have I not a parking in approach? Because I mean that this is the most interesting point to be discussed between us, and and other things. With respect to the effectiveness of the monetary policy, I completely agree with you. The channels are different of the usual one, the distributive effect. So it can have an effect, okay, the monetary policy, especially when you have a coordination with the fiscal policy. So when you speak about the dominance of the monetary policy, it means simply that nowadays, unlike then after the Second World War for 2 decades, here the fiscal policy adapt to some goals of the monetary policy in actual facts, not in the models, in the theory, in actual facts. With respect to the parking in approach, yes, I can agree. I would like to have, in a sense, a low real interest rate. Why? Because in this way you favor the wage rate, you have an increase in the wage rate, you have a low cost for the service of the public debt. So that can be, if you want a rule, some goal for the monetary policy, that can be a goal. As usual in all the Keynesian economies. If you read Caldor, if you read John Robinson, you find this. But this can be true for some countries. Are you sure that this same rule, or I don't like the term rule, but this same target of a real rate of interest of 1%, you cannot kill the rentier, so you are in a capitalist economy, but a real rate of interest of 1% is good, for instance, for Argentina? I don't believe so. So according to the circumstances, the central bank do what it believes is the best action to achieve their goals. For the advanced countries, yes, I would like to have very low interest rate. I am skeptical about the Fascinetti's rules, the idea of a fair rate of interest, both for theoretical reasons. I hope that we can the occasion to discuss about it, but also because I think, but we can discuss that if the change in the rate of interest has an effect on the functional income distribution, that rule can not be fair as you would suggest. But it can be a point that we can discuss. I can stop here.
I just want to add one thing. We're planning a workshop in November, provided we get the funding, to discuss precisely these issues.
Yes, I am working on it.
Yeah,
with Antonino. So it's
yeah.
I hope that you do not convince him that you are right and I am wrong.
Thank you, Sergio. We have a couple of minutes for a couple of questions. If there are someone from the public would like to ask or comment on the presentation. Ariel?
Well, thank you very much, Sergio and Louis-Philippe, for the intervention on the presentation. I will make just one remark and one question for both of us. The remark is that I think the important message of Levrero's presentation is not the fact that income distribution or actually the monetary policy will not have any effect on aggregate demand, for instance, but the fact is that there is no mechanical influence. So the fact that a decrease in the rate of interest increases aggregate demand in any way validates the so-called Taylor rule. Actually, the question would be, what is remained of the Taylor rule once we eliminate this mechanical connections between the rate of interest and aggregate demand. This is an important remark. For instance, you have discussed the ineffectiveness of the insensitivity, the inelasticity of aggregate demand of investment to the rate of interest. But another important point, and I think it's a more important point that is a consequence of the capital critiques, is the position of the IS. Because once you don't have full employment, where is the location?
Well,
No, this is it's
the
an
new
important
IS corresponding to the potential output. Yes,
absolutely. So, and the question now, I would like to bring you both to a more actual discussion about inflation. You all know that inflation has come back to the academia since the pandemic and also the war between Ukraine and Russia. There is some positions going on there. Isabella Weber, for instance, saying that the problem now is greed inflation, sort of profit inflation. So I would like to know first, what do you think about this explanation? And second, what the central bank should do, because according to Levrero's explanation, perhaps the most, at least in central countries, sensitive response to this kind of reaction would be to decrease the rate of interest if we want to decrease inflation. But thank you.
Let me just go first. I see him writing notes. Yeah, there's been a lot of discussions on inflation. The way I interpret profit inflation, so there's a lot of ambiguity about the concepts that are being discussed. First of all, how do we define profit inflation? I think that the emerging consensus is that profit inflation occurs when there's an increase in the markup. I think this is how it's being defined. And there's a lot of issues surrounding that. You know, Marc Lavoie wrote a blog about that, saying there has been no increase in the markup, perhaps except in the oil industry. So the question is there profit inflation? It's an empirical question. I don't think we're close to answering that at all. And the second thing is, what should central banks do? I just don't see the necessary relationship between monetary policy and inflation. I think that there's a breakup there. And regarding the Gibson's paradox, I've always been a fan of that, but it was pointed out to me that that relationship has broken down in the last 50 or 60 years. Now it's, increases in interest rates follow increases in prices and not the other way around. So, if you believe in a Pazinetti rule, for example, the answer is you don't do anything. You let fiscal policy deal with inflation, and you fall back on fiscal policy, which was the comment, the dog that didn't bark in the paper. That's my view. I think that we've been taken over by sort of inflation hysteria. First of all, I shouldn't say this to Argentinian, with inflation of what, 105% now, but it's been, certainly there's a lot of empirical papers that show that inflation is not a problem until it hits to 20, 25, 30%. Stiglitz have said this and others. So, why should central banks react when inflation is 5, 6, 7%? It's really a non-problem. Inflation does have effects, I recognize that, but the question is, what should central banks do? And I say, nothing. And I would probably say the same with Argentina, and let fiscal policy deal with, identify the true causes of inflation and then deal with those. Monetary policy is too blunt, too inaccurate policy tool.
Well, it's my time. Have you other comment? No. with respect to profit inflation, the debate on profit inflation, I agree with Louise, and I have agreed also with the blog of Marc Lavoie. I think that you can say that you have profit inflation if you have an increase in the profit margin. What is happening now? Now I can say something, indeed, looking at more at the experience of Italy, because of course I have analyzed this point looking at the experience of my country more than the United States or other countries. What is happening is that you have had a cost inflation and a worsening in the terms of trade, in a sense, and firms passed this increase in the cost of imported goods to price. Demanding wages does not change, and so you have had a very strong fall in the real wage rate. Is this profit inflation? Yes, indeed, you can say that it is not a profit inflation, but it is the result of the fact that the worsening in the terms of trade are paid only by workers and not by firms. So you can, this is a result, because in a sense, you have a cake that is smaller than before, you know, but only for the workers and not also for the firms. This is what occurred in Italy. So what is happening now in our country. When we look to the data, in Italy, perhaps you have had also an increase in the profit margin, because the rise that you have had in the share of profit in value added is so strong. It is the highest value from 2005. I mean, I don't remember now precisely the date. It has been so strong that, and there are also some other studies that confirm this, that you have had also some increase of the profit margin, at least in some sectors of the economy. In some, not in all the sectors, but in some sectors of the economy. This is the situation of in Italy. What should we do? Yes, of course. I think that the central bank should not react to cost inflation by rising the interest rate. But since we are discussing about the inflation targeting and the Taylor rule, also for the new consensus model, it is not true that you must react to cost inflation by rising the interest rate. So behind this decision by the central bank, there must be something else. And I don't know in the United States, but I could provide some proof with respect to the European Central Bank. They are rising the interest rate for two reasons. First, because they want to avoid a wage price spiral. So in order to avoid this, they rise the interest rate. It is a very strong signal to the governments and to the trade unions in this respect. Second, for the European Central Bank, there is also the problem of the exchange rate. Because the Federal Reserve raised the interest rate, also the European Central Bank has been forced to rise the interest rate in order to reduce the impact of the rise in the cost of imported goods that are paid in dollars on the European economy. So you have for the case of the European Central Bank, both these two factors, I mean. With respect to the Gibson paradox, of course, when you discuss of this paradox for a gold money economy or for an economy in which you have stable prices, it is completely different when you discuss this phenomenon that today is called price puzzle, when you have a situation of price of inflation. Okay, so when you think about the Gibson paradox, you are not discussing the change in the inflation rate on average when you have a rise or a fall in the interest rate. You are considering whether when you have a rise in the interest rate on impact, that is for a while, you have an increase in inflation rate, which means that you have for a while an increase in the prices to money wage ratio. Okay, then the inflation rate comes back to the previous value, or you must also take into account for the inflation rate the other channel, the possible demand channel, and also the demand channel, so the effect on distribution and so on that can stem from a change in the interest rate. So I think that it is not true. It is not correct to say that you do not have the Gibson paradox, because when you have an increase in the interest rate, you see a fall in the inflation rate, or vice versa. It's more, I think that it's more complicated. So because the relation is not between the rate of interest and the inflation rate, but it is between the rate of interest and the level of price. So it is a different relationship. With respect to, so yes, stop. So, but we agree we should use the fiscal policy. I am also in this case, I'm not sure that it is the good policy for Argentina, but I have, in preparing this seminar, I have studied for a month the macroeconomic condition of Argentina, and it has shocked me.
Was it enough time? 1 month?
Pardon?
Was it enough time to study Argentina?
No, it's not enough time. But at any rate, I can show you several graphs and several data about the exchange rate, the consumption, real wages, several things. Yes, in your situation, I think I am not sure that the fiscal policy, only the fiscal policy is sufficient in order to achieve some a better condition. Okay, we can stop.
Let me just add something about fiscal policy in Argentina. I will defer to the experts on that. But I want to go back to you said there were 2 reasons why central banks raised interest rates. Let me add a third, perhaps more cynical. Remember last year when central banks were saying inflation was going to be temporary? Turns out, I think they were right. And they only started raising interest rates when they were accused of being what's the word? Non-credible. Christine Lagarde was accused of being, non-credible. And in the Fed, there was lots of talks about central banks losing credibility on the issue. And I think that's when they started raising interest rates. That's a more cynical view. But I think you're right that they're raising rates in order to prevent a wage price spiral. But we know that's a non-argument because we know wages.
Yes, it's a no argument.
So I think it's a
flat Phillips curve.
I think it's pretty much a question of credibility vis-a-vis the financial players, the financial markets, and all of that. So Jerry Epstein says central banks policy is done through a finance colored lens. And I think that this is what, so.
I think we are running out of time. Let me just thank again Sergio, Luis Felipe, and the rest of the participants of the seminar. And we will invite Sergio to discuss, maybe not in this open space, your takes on the Argentinian situation. Also, Luis Felipe, in another occasion soon. Thank you very much, and see you in the next
your
seminar.
PhD thesis that I read several years ago, and I like it much. So
okay,
I would
sure.
like to say you.
Thank you, Sergio. Well, goodbye to everyone, and see you the next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.